Hey guys, welcome to episode 65 of The Green Life. Today's episode is with a returning guest. Brenda Davis was here for episode 34 and I have the pleasure of hosting her back today, not alone, but with her son, Cory Davis. Now, before I get into the details of this episode and why we have both Brenda and Cory on, I want to give a big shout out to Namawell for the J2 juicer, wonderful machine. If you guys are on the market for a new juicer and you really want to upgrade to a cold press, I would say the J2 is the best, and I have a discount code for you into the show notes that you can use. Also, Ecodharma Village in Portugal is open for the summer, but also we have a wonderful autumn equinox retreat coming up in September. So if you are free, want to come and visit, want to have a weekend with us, check out the details in the show notes as well, and just let us know. All right, back to the episode. I have now here Brenda and Cory because they co-authored a book together with Vesanto Melina, which is called Plant-Powered Protein. Of course, as vegans, we probably hear this all the time. Where do you get your protein? Well, this book covers that and more. But today, we're going to not talk about the nutritional side as much. We're going to talk about the environment. Cory's an expert in environment, and he really has connected all the dots in this book that talk about animal agriculture and sustainability and the impact that all of it is having on the planet. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about science behind climate change, or if you want to just understand what the impact of having animal agriculture is on our nature, this is a really good episode to listen to. All right, without further ado, let's dive into this. I'm really excited. Welcome, Brenda and Cory. Hello, Brenda and Cory. Thank you for joining me on The Green Life. How are you today?
Awesome.
Fantastic. Happy to be here. Thanks.
Me too.
Thank you. So, oh my God. So first thing first, congratulations on the new book. I read it and it's wonderful. And so many wonderful informations, and also just the golden nuggets, not only, of course, the nutritional side, very extensive, but this has got that extra because Cory joined you for the first time in authoring a book, and he brings his expertise all about environment and sustainability. So I am really looking forward to kind of diving into the subjects and also connecting the dots between nutrition and sustainability, and really clarifying a lot of people's doubts. There's a lot of rumors and saying out there, like people hear, I feel, information a little bit like fragmented information and then put it together, and it's not always correct. So I think we can really clarify a few doubts today. First of all,
you know what? I just have to tell you something, Chantal. We just hit the #1 bestseller in sustainability books on Amazon.ca. and #2 in Amazon.com under the vegan books. So people are seeing that sustainability here for sure.
#1 in sustainable agriculture and science. It was
the
category.
Thanks, Cory.
That is brilliant. Amazing. Let's get it into universities, right? So that we can actually teach people that are studying environment how to also go plant-based. Because I feel like, especially here, I had a meeting with the municipality the other day, and that connection is really not there for them. I'm like,
exactly.
That's the first thing you want to look at. So that's interesting. So you would really need to use this book to educate as many people as possible. So how did the idea of collaborating and co-authoring this book come about? I mean, I know that you, Brenda, you and Vesanto worked together like 13 times before on books. Right?
Yeah, not 13. I've written 13 books.
Okay.
We've done a few separately, but we've been writing together for about 30 years. So.
Wow. Amazing. And so how did the idea of bringing Cory into the mix come about? How did you decide to actually leap into this together?
Well, I'll start. Vesanto and I were asked by our publisher to write a book about plant-based protein because our publisher said, it's the question I always get asked when I'm at, all sorts of, exhibiting or doing whatever. People always say, well, how can you get enough protein on a plant-based diet? And so we decided to do it together, but we were talking and saying, because plant-based protein makes such a huge difference in terms of our environmental impact. We need to have a really strong environmental section in this book. And of course, we thought about Cory because he did his undergrad in environmental sciences. He's done a couple of master's degrees and has a master's of science and has a tremendous passion and knowledge for this area. And so when we asked him, he was all in right away. I'll let him tell you his version of the story.
So, wow, do I feel so privileged to have been uplifted by my mother and Vesanto to participate and contribute to this book, because it's something I've been thinking about almost my entire life. You know, I became an ethical vegetarian from the moment I realized where burgers came from. They came from cows. And that was such a disillusioning moment in my life that made me reflect at a very young age. And it wasn't until I was an early teenager when I started being exposed to environmental issues of our world. And it was really impactful for me. It was so impactful in my life. I remember walking into the newspaper office one day and just saying, why are you not publishing more on environment? And it just so happened that was before they published an article about me and my mom and Anthony Marr when we went on the Compassion for Animals road expedition across the United States. So, you know, I was very young at the time and naive and ignorant, but it was something that I really started to think about. And on the Compassion for Animals road expedition, I would give cooking demos of vegan and environmentally friendly foods and leading discussion groups at schools and various venues on the environmental impacts of food. So it was really something I started taking a deep dive into as an early teenager. And as I grew into an adult, I started a much broader sense. So I started going to school. I went to school in environmental land use planning, which really gave me a broad look and brought in some of that social issues as well. Like, how does our environment play into our sense of place here? How do we create happy and healthy communities through land use planning initiatives? And then, of course, I went on to do environmental science, where I did focus on sense of place, always bringing the science back to the social realm, because I truly believe that the environmental challenges we face today is just as much related to the social challenges we see today, and how our consumer decisions are really social justice decisions in what we are voting for and what we are buying with our hard-earned money. And so this was something that I was really thinking about. When I did my master's, I also interned with a plant-based food company and consulting company, and was looking at supply chains and all of these things. So right when they were writing that book, I was just finishing up my master's. And so that was top of mind for me. And so I was just thrilled when they asked, because I said, yes, my whole life culminated to this one point. I am going to help you out and write it down.
I love it. And I'm sure there will be more to come, because this is a very ongoing subject. And, you know, you tapped onto a very important thing. We'll dive into the social aspect of it. But I must say, you know, the very fact that you were involved with this movement and really looking at the ethics of it from a young age, it just shows that you have a very conscious soul. And I mean, I'm sure part of it is because mom is so into looking at animals as well as the nutrition. But I love when that happens, because I know for a fact I became vegan and plant-based in 10 years ago. And before that, I just didn't have the ability to make that connection, that I was in such a dissonance. I mean, you know, I grew up thinking milk was a natural byproduct of cows. I never even thought about the pregnancy that had to be experienced by the cow to give us the milk, or why we drinking another species milk when we actually also make milk, you know, when we're pregnant. And later,
Chantel,
yeah.
Oh, sorry, continue. I just have to share that Cory had these sensibilities it was just in him. And I can remember when he was 2 years old, a friend of his on purpose stepped on a spider and killed him. And Cory came running into the house screaming. I thought he had broken his leg or something. It's just, I guess he wouldn't have been running, or broken his arm, I guess. He cried and cried and cried and cried. And I can remember once, throwing a bug off the balcony. I think it was a spider. And Cory cried, saying I could have broken his legs. I could, he was always so sensitive to animals. Even I remember a bug in the bathtub, asking him to bring it to the garden. I put it in a little container. He came back in, tears coming down, saying, "Mom, I just couldn't do it. It's raining outside." He could drown out. So,
I love it.
In fact, the first time I got beat up as a child, I think I was about 6 or 7 years old. My friend David Foley and I, and shout out to David, he was one of my best friends. We were walking outside, and there was a kid who lived down the road from us, and he was using a lighter. He was older than us. He was about 9 years old. He was using a lighter to light ants on fire.
Oh, no.
My friend David, he was a little bit like, "Oh, that's weird." But me, this is a crisis. How could somebody be doing this to these creatures? And I just said, "No, please stop." Tears started coming up down my eyes, and yeah, he beat the crap out of me, and he broke my friend David's nose. And thank you for having my back, David, at such a young age. But David went in there and he was like, "No, you can't hurt Cory," and broke his nose. I was bleeding from my head, but that was, it's always been in me. It was just seeing something like that. You have to take action, right? And I didn't do it violently. I didn't come at it. I just said, "No, like, please don't do this. Please don't do that."
But he was a bully.
Yeah, and then in the Marshall Islands, there was a kid taking all the hermit crabs out of their houses, and Cory made him find houses for all the hermit crabs he had taken.
Damn right. I love it.
Yeah. After it rains outside, I was always one of those kids who would go and collect all of the worms all along the sidewalks and driveway, and I'd find them a nice place in the soil.
Oh, that is brilliant. Maybe you're a returning soul, I feel. Okay, you're returning.
For sure.
You were definitely an animal protector in another life. You just came back to do the same and more. I love that. Oh my God, beautiful. So as you grew up, obviously having this kind approach to animals, to food, to yourself, to your body, you would always, I guess, you were raised vegetarian. And then went vegan later. But did you get asked the question, would you get your protein many times?
Oh yes, many times.
So Brenda, how did you approach this? Because I'm sure the school was probably concerned because there was not enough education at the time, right? How did you approach this so that it would be okay and you're not, starving your kid?
Well, I didn't get much, backlash because I was a registered dietitian. And when Cory was young, I always was very conscious of making sure they had protein choices at each meal. So, in their sandwiches, I think his favorite sandwich was it's going to sound weird, but it was a mashed tofu with peanut butter and grated carrots. And it looked like, a little bit of lemon. It was delicious, sunflower seeds. And people often thought it was salmon because the finely grated carrots gave it that color. But we always made sure there was a good protein source at every meal. And we did include some veggie meats as well, lots of beans and, lots of ethnic foods. But we didn't ever hear, much concern from schools or anything like that. And in Canada, we didn't have a school lunch program, so the children just bring their lunches in a paper bag or a lunch box.
That probably saves a lot of life because the lunches in the US, they are terrible.
They're terrible.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay. So brilliant. So that's covered. Now, before we dive into the connection between food and protein and animal, that question here, we look at food almost in food groups, right? We always almost classify carbs, fats, and protein. So instead of actually looking at something that we eat that has mostly all the components, it's just that some averages are higher in one compound than the other. How did we get to this point where we actually classify things as protein? And why did animal products become the top protein source, even though we know that is not actually true? And how do we correct that mistaken view of proteins?
Yeah, well, if you look back in public health history, for so many years, malnutrition was the most serious public health concern. And government policies were really directed towards the elimination of hunger and malnutrition. And of course, animal products are very concentrated sources of protein. Meat is a fairly concentrated source of iron and zinc. Milk is a concentrated source of calcium. And so these animal products were really viewed as a critical part of that sort of solution, this crisis of malnutrition. And the early protein assessment or the protein quality assessment tools, like the protein efficiency ratio and the biological value of protein, actually favored animal products over plant foods because they generally used mice or rats in the testing. And of course, these are small fur-bearing animals that need a lot of sulfur-containing amino acids, which are more concentrated in animal products. Humans aren't fur-bearing animals. We don't need as much of these sulfur-containing amino acids. So it incorrectly really favored those foods. And then economic policies were developed to maximize the production of animal products and minimize malnutrition. And so we started giving subsidies and all, marketing support and price controls. And so the diseases of nutritional deficiencies did diminish. But the interests of animal agriculture really became very deeply entrenched in the economy. And what wasn't recognized, it literally gave animal products a bit of a health halo, with meat being associated with big muscles and dairy being associated with strong bones. And it was a lot of eat more messages, eat more meat, eat more milk, eat more food to prevent malnutrition. And of course, what ended up happening is the sort of eat more message kind of backfired, because now 70% of deaths globally are really associated with eating more, too much, overconsumption. And so the diseases, there's another form of malnutrition called overconsumption, which leads to chronic diseases like heart disease and type 2 diabetes, and some cancers are associated as well. And these are the diseases that really kill most of us now, as opposed to malnutrition. Malnutrition is still an issue in impoverished countries. And of course, malnutrition is an issue everywhere. And if we think of hunger versus overconsumption versus micronutrient deficiencies, which are the three main forms of malnutrition. But that's kind of how we started to really prize meat. But what's really interesting, and what I think is really worth recognizing, is that most of the major national and international health organizations today are recommending that we shift to more, plant-strong diets. And in fact, Canada's Food Guide recommends eating plant-sourced protein foods every day, and more plant-sourced proteins. And if you look at international groups like the World Health Organization, the FAO, the IPCC, the Eat Lancet Commission, they're all recommending the shift. And many countries, not just Canada, but Germany, Brazil, Sweden, Qatar, Switzerland, England, China, are all recommending that people actually rely more on plant protein sources. So it's really starting to shift.
Yeah, that's good news. Thank you for that. I mean, and you actually mentioned something that will take us straight into the conversation about the environment. It became a political leveraged issue to use animal protein, and it's more profitable, right, to use animal protein. So, Cory, can you just first of all explain what the current climate crisis is and how animal agriculture taps into that?
Yeah, of course. So as many of your viewers will be aware, the recent IPCC report came out urging the public and governments to initiate action on climate. We don't want to surpass 1.5 degrees Celsius as per the Paris Accord Agreement. And it looks like we will, at least temporarily, we will, which is troubling because, of course, the climate crisis is responsible for so much trauma in the world today. So much of our trauma is related to climate. In fact, some studies show that people are more aggressive when the heat rises. So in warmer climates, you see more aggression than cooler climates. So this is well known. But of course, the climate crisis is responsible for an increased frequency and severity of drought, wildfire, landslides, and all other kinds of natural disasters as well. Flooding is another one, extreme heat events, and also the spread of disease and pests. You know, it's really easy to see the pest issue, especially when you're going further north, because all those little, in Canada at least, we call them no-see-ums, these little tiny black flies are coming out in droves, just clouds of them. And the reason is, and same with mosquitoes, by the way, because climate change is responsible for increasing the time of summer or of heat. Our winters are shorter or getting shorter, and so is our spring, right? And that comes with it longer breeding seasons for these little pests, right? Also, because humans have created corridors all throughout the world, it's easy to spread disease and pests, which makes our ecosystems less resilient, or our agricultural systems in particular, vulnerable to disease and pests, especially since we don't grow a vast diversity of plants. There's so much of our agriculture are these large monoculture crops. And I understand why we're focused on yield right now at the expense of long-term sustainability and resilience of our agricultural system and food security. So in addition to disease, pests, wildfires, natural disasters increasing, the most impacted populations of these are the most vulnerable in the world. And this is why it truly is a social crisis, not just a climate crisis. And for example, in countries that are much poorer than the countries I live in, who have a lot less resources to protect them from this external threat of climate change, it's women, elderly, and children who are at most risk of death from these climate-induced events. And for this, we're all responsible for that. We all need to take responsibility in our decision-making. Further to this, of course, climate change is creating ecosystem change. And with that, wildlife change. So some ecosystems are contracting, some are expanding, some are shifting geographically. And if we want to be forward-thinking about conserving and protecting our wildlife habitat, we really got to think in terms of those corridors. As ecosystems are shifting north or south or expanding, contracting, we got to ensure that wildlife can move to those areas. And right now we've created a lot of corridors specific for human growth, corridors to natural resources, for example, corridors for us to travel, for example. And so that's an issue I see. But certainly, if we want to think about the food we eat and how that contributes to climate change, our consumer decisions can be very impactful. And I'll just give you an example. Beef is known to be one of the largest emitters of methane and the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the agriculture sector. Lentils, very low. Lentils emit very little, and peas even less. In fact, peas emit about 100 times less than beef, and legumes, I think 98% less, so about 50 times less, 48 times less, I believe. I don't have the figures in front of me, I apologize. But the relative reduction in emissions you could achieve by switching from something like a meatloaf to a lentil loaf would be astronomical. It's 98% reduction. If you switch to peas, like there's this product I recently tried, tempeh, and it's making tempeh with peas. It's absolutely delicious. The relative reduction in emissions switching from beef to tempeh would also be just massive. But if you compare that to, we often hear about the transportation sector.
Yeah.
And, buy a hybrid, drive less. Well, switching from a regular car to a hybrid car would reduce your amount of greenhouse gas emissions from driving by, I believe it's around 46% on average, which is a lot less than 98%. And I like to use that comparison because we know that at a minimum, agriculture is animal agriculture alone is comparable in the amount of emissions to the transportation sector. That's coming from the tailpipes of all planes, trains, and automobiles and boats, not necessarily to production, but coming out of the tailpipes, it's the burning of the fossil fuel. It's comparable to that at a minimum, because that doesn't take into account land use change. We've cleared a lot of forest. We've cleared a lot of forest, and we've transformed so much land into agricultural land that were carbon sinks. And now they're carbon sources. So when you take that into account, and of course, this requires more research, a lot of people have looked into this. There's a paper published by Nature Sustainability. It's a journal published by Nature, one of the most well-respected publishers of scientific literature in the world, came out saying that we are deeply underestimating the opportunity cost of land use change. And of course, when the UN Food and Agricultural Association came out with that 14.5%, animal agriculture is responsible for 14.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions. It's really difficult to say, it's this percent or it's that percent, because what other sectors are you including? Are you including transportation? And how do you, so regardless, 14.5%, but in there, they said the opportunity cost is zero for land use change. And we know now that that is outdated, of course, with all the literature coming out in support of that. So something to certainly reflect on. But for the individual, any individual who's on a mission like me to minimize my footprint in this beautiful world we live, and trying to normalize that behavior for others, right? Perhaps one of the most impactful things we could do, the easiest thing we could do, is just small dietary shifts. And you could see dramatic reductions in your impact.
Yeah. And, as you said that, I thought about what people usually say when we have these conversations about the use of land and how much deforestation has happened for agriculture. And they say, yeah, well, you are blaming the animals, but most of these lands are also used for soy and corn. And I like you to point out where most of the production is going, because I know that there are a lot of people that say, oh, we are using this to feed the world, but actually it's not a direct feeding of human beings either. So if you can clarify that part, that would be really good.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point you're making, because a lot of crops we grow are for animal feed, For example, in the Amazon rainforest, a lot of that, the majority of clearing Amazon rainforest is for feed. Soy is huge there, and grazing. And so I know a lot of folks, and it's, you know, I empathize with this because it just seems so obvious. We are promoting people to eat soy. Soy is known to be this big destructive crop. At least that's what they say, right? Monsanto, Roundup Ready soy, right? And so I could see that connection. In fact, I was looking at doing a PhD. And so I started reaching out to professors. You know, I'm thinking about what I want to study for my PhD. So I'm reaching out to professors, and I met this guy. He's very good. He did land use planning and agriculture. And so I was really impressed by his bio. And so I started talking to him. And of course, it's an ongoing conversation with him. But one of the things I said was, I would also like to study land use and agriculture and see what kind of capacity we could create, what yield could we create to feed the public if we started a plant-based transition, right? Are we going to see gains or losses? How will it impact people regionally? And one of the things I did tell him was that I too am plant-based, and, you know, I love tofu, and I want others to try it as well and see if they like it. And he said, tofu, don't you know that's this big monoculture destructive crop? Why would you support tofu? And what he's referring to are these large, very large crops of soy, oftentimes Monsanto Roundup Ready soy. But most of that is going to animals. And I should let you know, I'm from Canada. When I go to the grocery store and I look for tofu, as I always do, almost every single package says non-GMO. Or it says organic. Yeah. We are not the vegans or the people eating tofu. In Chinese restaurants, for example, purchase a lot of tofu. We're not the ones driving demand for Monsanto Roundup Ready soy. That's not the market we're going for. In fact, of all the soy we grow, only about 7% is for direct human consumption. The rest is all to feed animals. Soy is a crop that we feed mostly to chicken, is the biggest buyer to feed chickens. So eating chicken, you're really supporting that soy production, but only 7% for human consumption. And the lion's share of that 7% is oils, flours. It goes to processed foods. It's just a couple percent of that is for tofu. We are by far not driving demand for this kind of agriculture. That's not what's producing our soy. In fact, the meat industry is promoting that product. I believe it was Unearthed and Greenpeace did an analysis of the chemical industry, specifically with pesticides. And they found that animal feed crops are driving the demand for hazardous pesticides to support these large crops. And as you could imagine, right, there's so many animals out there. We've got 110 million cattle in North America, much more chicken. There's much more livestock in this world, pigs, chickens, and cows, than all mammals and birds on planet Earth. We're actually replacing wildlife at a staggering rate with wildlife. And we've got to feed them all. And, you know, chickens and pigs and even cows aren't only eating grass, certainly not chickens and pigs. Chickens who are kept in cages all day, they're fed feed. But what I'm trying to point out is that a vast amount of agricultural land is going just to feed these animals, and it's doing so very inefficiently. The conversion to protein is very inefficient. So we could feed a lot more people if we were just to use this agricultural land alone, which reminds me of a 2018 study which did this analysis for the United States and found that if they were to transition to a plant-based diet and use these crops to directly feed people, the United States could feed 350 million more people. That's double the population now. So that's quite a staggering number. And by the way, I should mention that this is with comparable plant-based alternatives to the meat categories that they were assessing. So it's not just 350 million people with grains and corn.
Yeah.
Okay. And so this gets me to another point, that there's this massive feed industry out there. And so vegans often get blamed for eating quinoa. I don't know why. Quinoa doesn't use a lot of water. It's not very environmentally destructive, to the best of my ability. It's not resource intensive, I should say. I don't understand why vegans would get the blame for eating quinoa, because to the best of my knowledge, a lot of people eat quinoa. A lot of people eat almonds, right? That's not a vegan issue, almonds, right? So that kind of boggles my mind. But I mention this because they often say, well, you're importing avocados, you're importing quinoa. But the feed industry is importing and exporting vast quantities of feed all over the world for the meat that we produce. Brazil's soy, for example, goes all over the world. I live in Canada. We export quite a lot of feed as well. The United States exports feed and imports feed. We export feed and import feed. There's just this massive global economic enterprise of feed. And that never gets discussed. So when I hear people pointing out to vegans in our diets of, we try and eat, I at least try to eat a diverse range of different foods. And of course, some of those are impacted. I really are imported. Of course, I really like to slant local where I can and go to the farmer's market and so forth. I really support that, but I can't help but buy an avocado every now and then. And of course, that's imported, and there is large, I would say there's an environmental impact. They often have to be shipped by plane because they have a short amount of time before they spoil. And so I do eat them sparingly. And that's something that I really want to promote. Eat sparingly, more resource intensive foods, and, slant your diet to the most or the least resource intensive foods, right?
Yeah.
So I really don't understand that argument when people point their fingers at vegans for eating soy, as we discussed, or eating avocados or quinoa, which I don't understand because every omnivore I know eats quinoa and avocados. So I hardly believe that's a vegan issue. But the feed industry, that never gets a lot of attention. What is the greenhouse gas footprint of all of the feed that's being exported all over the world? I don't know, because it's rarely discussed.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of these things don't come out when it comes to feed, because even when it comes to the news, there is an agenda that is pushed by the people that give the most money. That's in every country. So of course, if they are also invested in agriculture, they're not going to want to have the soy issue for animal feed as a as the headline. Let's just blame a group of people for driving, things in a certain way. I mean, I know that quinoa can be controversial, and again, it's not because of vegans, but because when it became quite popular, Peru saw this massive, companies coming in basically and getting all the good quality quinoa, exporting it, and making it really hard for the locals to afford what they always used to eat. But more and more companies are actually trying to grow quinoa in different countries. So I know the UK started, Portugal even started. I just found a company that grows their own quinoa. Yes, it's more expensive at this point in time because I think they're just perfecting their, ways of growing it in an environment that is not native to the grain, to the seed, actually, I should say. But I think with time, as you get better and better at the technology that you're using to growing these crops, it will be cheaper and more affordable. And then, of course, it becomes also local, which is much more sustainable. Same with avocados. There's a farm that just opened. It's an investment by an Israeli company that just opened or started operation, I should say, in the south of Portugal, where they are growing they're starting to plant, they planted all the trees and they're starting this operation with a minimum use of water, because I know avocados can be quite water intensive, but they will be grown locally and the most efficient way, so that we can just cut these shippings. And so I think that's the thing that always baffled me when we talk about the environment. I feel like we have such advances in technology that if we use them right, we really shouldn't even have a problem of trying to grow different things, especially in greenhouses, because ultimately probably that's a better environment for food at this point, because our atmosphere is highly polluted, and there are other challenges that we face with different weather. So greenhouses can be very helpful. And then that would mean making sustainable agriculture more affordable, and also teaching people how to do it, so that every country and every city can also have their hubs to learning how to do sustainable agriculture, and moving away from this monoculture that you mentioned, which actually does impact the soil heavily. And I just was wondering, because obviously people then say, okay, but I don't eat cow meat. I go for, little farms, they're sustainable, which now, of course, the first point is, well, there is not enough of that for everybody, even if you wanted to think that's more sustainable. But, is that a way that the animals that we have already here, because we don't want to slaughter them, that they could live grazing in fields, that they can also be used for growing food in a very sustainable way, using regenerative agriculture, agroforestry? Is that a way that the animals that we have created for food and that have been ruining the land can also actually kind of bring back that sustainability? You know what I mean? Like connecting sustainable agriculture and the animals that we have already?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This has often been in the forefront of media, at least the media I see, because I'm looking at this stuff all the time. I'm not a big believer in regenerative grazing. There's been a lot of claims that just didn't actually pan out about sequestering carbon in the soils and so forth. Of course, we know soils reach an equilibrium of carbon. It can't continually sequester that carbon. For me, it wouldn't be sustainable if we keep eating the way we do. It really requires a reduction in the amount of cows. Right now, a lot of agriculture is concentrated, right? If we want to talk being more sustainable with our grazing, reducing the grazing pressure on the landscape. Of course, overgrazing is associated with all kinds of environmental risks and degradation. It would require less intensive grazing, which means that it would require more land. It would be more herding and so forth. And we just don't have that much land on the planet, right? There's certain trade-offs that you get from concentrated animal feeding operations to these pastoral ones. Now, I live in Canada, and we always see these small pastoral family farms, cattle grazing in this picturesque landscape. Looks absolutely beautiful. And that's what people see, right? People see that, and that's what they think the industry is. But what we don't realize, and this is the case where I'm from, I'm not sure where you're from, but where I'm from, that's just one step in the supply chain, the small family farm. Because of course, in the fall, when cattle are about 18 months old, very young, they reach perhaps what you would call some kind of peak weight or an optimal weight to auction them off. And when they auction these cattle off, what they're doing is they're auctioning them to feedlots. Now, being in British Columbia, 90% of those cattle are shipped to 2 feedlots in Alberta. Only a couple, 1% to 2% or so that I'm aware of is slaughtered locally. The rest are all shipped to the United States and other feedlot operations. But what we've got to understand is that these farmers are working on such low profit margins, very low profit margins. We often see very wealthy people come to British Columbia and purchase these big ranches, and they see losses. It's more for the lifestyle. And there's a lot of public funding and public support for these operations. supporting feed, subsidized feed, for example, is one of them. But this translates to the feedlot as well. The feedlots work on such low profit margins that often teeter profitability and loss, very small teetering. And the way to overcome this is to develop economies of scale, where a small teeter won't have such a large impact on your operations. So the larger you are as a feedlot, the more sustainable you can become. And so that's what we've seen over the past 50 years, is this concentration to much larger and larger feedlots and fewer of them. And those have all kinds of environmental risks as well. These are concentrated animal feeding operations. They're factory farms. That's the part of the supply chain we don't see. Mm-hmm. So we often see cows and, all these family farmers and these ranchers who are so nice. A lot of my colleagues are ranchers. And so I'm very closely associated with many, and they're lovely people. That's one thing that we should also recognize. We can't be villainizing ranchers or anybody in the industry from my perspective. It's really a systemic issue in our modern agricultural system today. And of course, it's the public who don't realize this, and you can't blame them because that's what they see, right? And it's just a matter of enlightening that fact. So they go to the feedlot, and they're often these big, massive, concentrated animal feeding operations, call them CAFOs for short. And then after they're slaughtered, they're fed, brought up to slaughter weight, as the industry likes to call it. I like to say they're fattening them up for the kill. They're fed all kinds of foods, from grain to grain products. So they're not only eating, the best part of the plant, they're eating all kinds of byproducts from the food we eat, from our canola farms, from everywhere. But it still takes a lot of cropland that could feed people more efficiently than feeding these animals. And then they go to slaughter, and then they go to a packaging plant before they reach the store shelves. And so, no, I don't necessarily think that if we were just to transition our agricultural system to be more pastoral, and there's actually studies showing that this is not the trend, and they've done several models of what they think the future will look like. And it does look like we're going to be moving away from more and more pastoral systems to more and more factory-like systems. And several of the models, in fact, all of the models I've seen show this outcome if demand for meat products keep increasing. So one, economically, no, we can't go to a pastoral system because that's more expensive for the farmers who are already make low profit margins. And that's why you often see it in the industry. They're very defensive when environmental issues come up, because that little bit of extra work to do a better job serving the environment is threatening for them, right? So when we see regulatory initiatives that really try to improve the environmental aspects of agriculture here in BC, recently there was something about water and wanting to document the watering of livestock. Well, a lot of these farmers live in very rural areas without access to internet. So that's one barrier to reporting watering of their livestock online. They'll have to come into town, go to the library and do it on the computer there. But just little improvements in environmental stewardship can have economic impacts. It is an economic impact. And when you're teetering on that profit margin, it really doesn't make sense for them economically, right? And so a complete shift to this more pastoral, I don't think it's practical, for one. I don't think it's economical. And we certainly couldn't do it feeding people the amount of meat that we're feeding them today. And so if we want to go to a more pastoral system, we would have to greatly reduce how many livestock we're producing today.
And actually, can I just can you please just highlight one point? A lot of people don't understand that actually we are the ones that create more and more of these animals that would probably not repropriate as quickly. A lot of people don't connect the dairy industry and meat industry, for example. They don't understand. I said at the beginning, I thought as a child that milk was byproduct of cow's life, but a lot of people don't understand actually we are participant in impregnating a lot of cows. So if you can touch on that as you continue this discussion, because I think with that, people may actually have the aha moment that it's not by chance that we have so many animals. Because of course, the question is, what are you going to do with all these animals then, right?
Yeah, that's right. And this is really a deep question. Of course, the dairy industry has a byproduct, and that byproduct is calves, because you have to continually impregnate mothers to keep producing milk. And some people just never thought about that. When I've brought this up just nonchalantly, amicably, I'm not blaming it, to produce milk, you have to have a baby. Well, how do they have babies? And this is a really sad story that just pries at my heartbone, but very difficult for me to discuss just because it's so profoundly disturbing, the dairy industry and how they operate. So yeah, sorry to get off track there. What was it? Can you rephrase the question again? Sidelined me.
No, I know, and it's actually connected because I feel the same way. But basically, a lot of people will say, well, we have so many cows already. What are you going to do with them? Are you going to kill them? And what are you going to do with them? And also the very fact that where you just highlighted, it is quite disturbing how we have more and more of these big animals like cows in the fields because we actually participate in the impregnation of them. Otherwise, they wouldn't have as many calves.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I should say that the kind of cows, there's all kinds of different breeds of cows. And so dairy cows are a certain breed, and the male offspring are typically not that great at producing meat. And so they're often either just killed or they're killed for veal. Oftentimes they're not even killed for veal. So because these aren't the beef cow breeds, they're often seen as useless. So that's not why there's so many cows. The cows are related to demand. So if you look at a supply and demand curve, you'll know how that system kind of operates. And so if we're not buying as many cows, they're not going to produce as many cows.
Yeah.
Right. So that's one thing. So dairy cows and beef cows are often different species, or not species, sorry, but different breeds. And we do eat dairy cows. Don't get me wrong. They do go when a dairy cow is done producing milk and she can no longer produce milk any longer. Oftentimes she will be slaughtered for meat. She's very big, but to raise male cows to that kind of size for meat, it doesn't make sense economically. So we don't often do that. Oftentimes they're just killed on the spot or raised for a little while to produce veal. With that said, what are we going to do with all of these animals? That's a really important question, because one of the things cattle do, for example, and we'll just focus on cattle right now, is we've changed ecosystems to accommodate them. Oftentimes, cows don't necessarily get along with other wildlife, right? We change the ecosystem to be productive, to optimize the production of cattle. And there's all kinds of this livestock wildlife interface is managed by our forces, managing for disease, pest, competition, things like that. And the result of this is we have removed a lot of the large herbivores. For one, the bison in the Great Plains, the feral horses that were introduced by the Spanish, by the way, in the southern interior of British Columbia, where I'm from. But just across the Rocky Mountains, you get into the Great Plains. Well, the Great Plains used to have millions of bison roaming the landscape. Of course, all kinds of concerns. The loss of the bison populations was there was many factors, but one of them was we want to raise cattle. Cattle are the new and better breed of animal that is more productive for human society because they produce really good meat, right? And so that was one of the forces that drove away the bisons. But we also, in replacing bison with cattle, we also needed to control the predator, like the Great Plains grizzly bear, for one, is completely extirpated from the natural environment. We've been controlling for wolves. We've been controlling for grizzly bears, black bears, cougars, and there's massive campaigns out there in North America, and in fact around the world, of livestock producers wanting to control predator populations. Of course, they have to. Again, it's really hard to blame them because they threaten their livelihoods. Losing one or two livestock can have massive economic implications for especially a small farmer with less than 100 head of cattle, right? That can see massive economic losses. So on one hand, I empathize with that, but on the other, I really value resilient ecosystems, and it breaks my heart to see this happen. Of course, apex predators, those are predators who don't have any other predators preying on them. And then there's mesopredators, predators who also have predators preying on them. So you'd think of like a coyote as a mesopredator, and perhaps like a grizzly bear or a wolf being an apex predator. What we know is that apex predators, for example, have profound impacts on ecosystems, one that we're only starting to really understand in recent decades. And there is a shift. People are recognizing that. We've reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone National Park, for example, and seen astounding results on ecosystems. Ecologists often talk about apex predators in terms of trophic cascades. And so it's this top-down force of how a predator behaves influences the rest of the ecosystem. And so the most simplified trophic cascade would be managing herbivore populations, right? So if herbivore populations get too large, there's massive impacts to the vegetation. It could expose soil, it will change plant communities and so forth. The ecosystem in general simplifies, right? And what we want is biodiverse ecosystems that are resilient, right? And it goes beyond that. So that's the most simplified trophic cascade. It's the predator manages herbivore population, which in turn has impacts to the vegetation. Very, very simplified. But there's more than that. You know, there's also an ecology of fear as well that influences herbivore behavior, right? They'll look over their shoulders, right? It influences their behavior. If the apex predator is removed, then the behavior of herbivores changes. True. And so there's all kinds of impacts apex predators have on an ecosystem. And many have actually shown the management of pests and disease and microbial communities and so forth all have influences from that trophic cascade. The impacts go far beyond that simplified version of vegetation management, which I mentioned. And so the transition away from livestock who have replaced the herbivores will have to be it's going to be a difficult transition. So we've removed the predators. I talked about this. There's all kinds of impacts that we've created. We've controlled the natural environment for our food production without giving much thought. Early on in the days, at least, we're giving it more and more thought now with our management, but those impacts are already there. We've lost the grizzly bear of the plains. That's done. But what they've said is the cattle will be mimicking, or they're trying to get cattle to mimic bison. So we've replaced bison with cattle. And of course, grasslands, for example, in the Great Plains, they need to be grazed by someone. And right now, that ecosystem service is being provided by cattle. So if we were to just remove cattle, there's going to be all kinds of impacts on our grasslands. So how do we manage for that? And we can't instantly just reintroduce bison. That's going to be a long process. I don't have the answer, but it's certainly got to be forward thinking, a strategic, and it would probably be a long transition. We can't just see a removal of cattle from the landscape. It's got to be, and it probably will be, a slow transition as demand slowly decreases through this social reawakening we're having, or the social transition we're having away from animal-based products towards plant-based products. It will probably be a slow transition. And we use cattle manure for fertilizing fields, for example. There's a nitrogen management challenge ahead as well with that. So there's a lot of innovation that needs to occur. We've got to provide solutions, but we don't do things because they're easy. I've heard, oh, we've tried to introduce bison here or there and it didn't work. But we introduced bison over there and it did work, right? And we've got to think about things in systems. And some of those examples of where it didn't work, well, were there predators? Were there other herbivores? Was it in an exclosure where migratory movement isn't occurring? Was there edge habitats present there, you know? And so sometimes those things aren't taken into account. And then you say, oh, well, it didn't work, so it's too difficult. We're not going to reintroduce bison. I don't agree with that. I think that it's something that has to be done. We have to have something out there on the land grazing. And I want it to be that thing that co-evolved with that ecosystem for millennia.
Yeah. You know, you segued actually into something here. The patience that it requires to make transitions, because I feel like one of the things we have to acknowledge as humans is that we have had a very big and quick impact on the environment by making choices like, you know, we have to produce meat, let's just deforestation and let's have cattle and monoculture, and not thinking about the consequences and the ripple effect. And then, of course, we are seeing the results. And for us, it's very backtrack, because we've taken these very quick steps and we can't take quick steps backwards because nature doesn't work like we do in the destructive sense most of the time. And I saw an article that talked about reforestation, because obviously at the beginning you mentioned we have droughts, we have floods, we have slides, we have a lot of stuff that is happening in these disasters because of the way that we have impacted the environment. And by environment I mean even the soil. And it's not as easy as just going somewhere, planting a tree, and that is done, because actually as you impact the soil, and as you mentioned, there is a lot of nutrients and chemicals. You know, there's a whole chemistry that has to be taken into consideration when the soil is left virgin. That many things are happening, including the biodiversity of the microbiome, just like in our gut, right, Brenda? The microbiome of the soil is equally as important to how the biodiversity and how plants can thrive, including trees. And so having patience, I think, is a really big message. Because I feel like we just don't have that. As you mentioned, right? They tried, oh, let's put bison here. It didn't work. Well, it doesn't work. No, actually, you have to understand many sides of this, and it has to be holistic. Just nature is holistic. We are meant to be holistic. It's just that we really lost that connection to our being in a way through the years, through the ages. And I know that sometimes it's by necessity, right? Like we went through the war, like, okay, people were starving. What are you going to do, right? But now we're not at war. I mean, let's not go there. But you know, it's not World War II anymore. We have a lot of advances in a lot of things. We can produce. We can be much more positively impacting the environment as well as our health. So we should do it. But I feel like there are so many almost like blocks along the way for whatever reason. And one of them is we have no patience. We want immediate returns for whatever investment we're making. Is really that immediate reward kind of mentality, right? The social media age. And I feel like this is such an important point. And just because I am thinking about the soil, I would love you to talk to you. And you actually mentioned the water problem. How does raising cattle for food impact our water supplies and quality and also the availability? And what would be better solutions to that problem if we went on a plant-based side?
Yeah, that's a really important question. First, just to address what you initially talked about reforesting, we've done a lot of deforestation. To get back to an old growth forest, for example, that would take hundreds of years, even if you were to plant the trees, which I wouldn't suggest because there are benefits to natural succession, right? And if you're going from very disturbed soils, going through that natural successional stages of, here in Canada, our dominant forest type would be conifer forests, the pine trees and so forth. To get to a pine tree forest, you either got to plant pine trees or you go through this natural succession, they call it. It'll go from weedy species like fireweed, and then you'll get some deciduous trees coming up. And then, after many, many decades, you'll see some pines starting, goes through the succession of different ecosystem types before it gets to this dominant forest type. And that's going to take hundreds of years, something that we're not very patient about. So I just wanted to add that. But in terms of water and cattle specifically, since you asked that, there was an interesting study done, I believe it was in 2020, from Nature Sustainability again, another paper, or another journal that I deeply respect, who assessed all river water users in the Western United States. Because of course, there's water scarcity issues in the Western United States. And so they wanted to think about, well, who's using the most river water? Is it the most effective use? What kind of management implications could this data have? And what they found was that animal feed crops, specifically cattle feed crops, for both dairy and beef cows, were the leading drivers of water shortages and fish imperilment in all of the Western United States. And so when we think about water use, we often think, okay, well, aquifers are low. We're thinking about water security, but what we're often not thinking about are impacts to aquatic ecosystems and things like that. And of course, fish imperilment, thinking we're using that much water that we're imperiling fish. Fish are threatened because we're using so much water. Wow, is that a profound piece of data? Because of course, fish sustain indigenous populations. They could be keystone species in aquatic habitats. Oftentimes, like our salmon, go from rivers to ocean back into rivers, so that they go into the ocean and can impact ocean life, ocean mammals who might feed on salmon, and so forth. So there's vast impacts that go far beyond just water security here. And then water scarcity. We're often hearing about droughts too, in which cattlemen or ranchers are having to cull their own herd, having to kill their own herd in face of drought. And I just think, how ironic is that? In Western United States, they do produce a lot of food, right? They produce a lot of food, but it was cattle feed crops specifically that's driving these water shortages and fish endangerment challenges they're having. So it's a very inefficient use of water, these feed crops. Of course, we could design our agricultural system to promote less water intensive feed crops, but we're still taking into account that inefficiency of feed to protein conversion that we see in cattle. It's very inefficient. It's much more efficient if we were to even if we were to throw away a lot of the plant and just extract out the protein and eat it directly. It would probably be much more efficient. But what I want to see is a diverse range of crops that we're growing, ranging from moderate to low water intensive types crops, trending towards low water intense crops. Peas, again, are such a great source of protein. And very environmentally sustainable. And same with legumes and soy as well. It doesn't use a lot of water. We often hear about almond milk, for example, and we should know that almond milk uses perhaps half as much as dairy milk, but depending on which almond milk you're buying, of course, almond milk is mostly water. It's not a bag full of almonds.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of almond in there and then a lot of water, right? And so oftentimes we get a lot of flack for almond production because nuts do use a lot of water, but we often eat nuts sparingly. About an ounce is a common serving size of nuts, right? It's not a 6-ounce steak, which is a common serving size. So got to think in relative terms as well. So it's not that I'm against nut farms. Of course, nuts probably emit the least amount of greenhouse gas emissions. In some cases, have negative greenhouse gas emissions because they're trees. Right? So there's opportunity costs there as well, right? There's trade-offs. Use some more water, but then again, I would suggest that people eat nuts sparingly, and I believe most people already do. We're not eating steaks of nuts.
Yeah.
As a plant-based alternative. Eat seeds. Seeds are very good. Pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, they're very good sources of protein and all kinds of, Mom can talk about it much better than I can, but certainly I would suggest eating a wide diversity trending towards low-intensive foods. And animal agriculture, when you look at the list of the most intensive water users and the least intensive water users, you will see that trend. Of course, nuts and cheese will be at the top. Typically, we use very little of those, and then it's almost all animal products. Rice is up there. Rice is a very resource-intensive food. Uses lots of water, also emits greenhouse gas emissions. And so, I don't suggest eating rice every day, but rather eat diversity, eat some quinoa. But I love barley. Barley grows here a lot. I live in Canada, so we got lots of flax. We grow a ton of beans. I think Canada supplied India with about a third of its lentils.
Wow.
We're certainly well positioned to be a plant-based leader in the world. We have a massive bean industry here in Canada. But I like to slant local as well, but also eat diversity. I'll have some quinoa, I'll have some black rice. I love black rice, but I eat it very sparingly, right? Because I want diversity and I want to just trend towards the low impacting foods. And that's what I'd recommend to the listeners as well. But certainly animal agriculture uses a ton of water. And if I could, just for a moment, we often hear about industrial practices such as fracking and their water use. It's about 70 to 140 billion gallons of water a year. And I echo that. It's a large user of water. We often hear to be cognizant of our water use at home. Don't water your lawn, take shorter showers. I do that too. I don't water my lawn. I try and take short showers. I couldn't agree more with that. Our home water use, by the way, accounts for about 4% of humanity's total water use. Agriculture uses tens of trillions of gallons of water a year. Tens of trillions of gallons of water a year. And we don't often hear about the agricultural sector and their water use. I often hear oil and gas and their water use. I often hear it directed at me for, don't water your lawn. Okay, I don't. I like to dry my clothes outside, and I like to use low water cycles in my laundry machine. I really try my best to minimize my water use at home. But perhaps the biggest gains you could achieve for minimizing your water footprint is just small shifts in your diet. And it doesn't have to be a big, arduous task to do, right? Even just by replacing small amounts of meat with legumes in your diet or tofu in your diet, you can see massive, massive impacts on our water use because we don't evaluate water properly for its true cost. It's not a commodity traded on the global market. Bottled water might be, but you're paying for convenience with bottled water. You're not necessarily paying for the water, which they pay next to nothing for to get it into those bottles, right? So you don't see that reflected in the food price. But if you're willing and able and want to minimize your water footprint, one thing you could do is buy our book, Plant Powered Protein, where I do show the protein sources, or go online to Our World in Data, who has interactive charts that will show you. You could select different foods on and off for free, and just see what foods contribute the least amount of water pollution, the least amount of water use, the most greenhouse gas emissions. And you could just trend your diet in that way. Yeah. You're thoughtful enough to do so. I really encourage you to do that, because you could see the biggest gains and losses with diet. I do believe that. Of course, agriculture uses ridiculously, by far, the most amount of water in the world. And there's huge differentials between the different kinds of protein choices, massive differentials. Yeah. And so if you really want to create impact, I highly encourage people to look into that.
Yeah, I want to just highlight one thing. I know we're running out of time, so very quickly. In the documentary, What the Health, they showed this the families that were living close to pig farms, and they were all getting sick because the water was actually contaminated by the feces of the pigs. So I think if you can just also mention the human impact through water that we have when we are, because of factory farming. I think a lot of people don't really think that. A lot of people are lucky not to have to deal with that. But you mentioned the social justice. And I think when we look at that, the people that suffer the most, even from these kind of examples, are minorities, right? In poorer neighborhoods. In fact, that was what was portrayed in the documentary anyway. But even when we look at food deserts often means you don't have access to fresh fruit and vegetables, but you will have access to a lot of junk food, mostly animal products. So there's obviously a social impact here. There's definitely a little bit of racism going on as well. I mean, Dr. Mills was in the US was actually talking about the dairy industry as also a racist industry, because a lot of melanated people cannot consume dairy products. So there's a knock-on effect. But yeah, I'd like to stay on the water for that example that was portrayed in the documentary. If you can just highlight any information that you have.
Yeah, I'm really happy you brought up this question, because it is so much linked towards the social issues we see. And of course, water pollution impacts underprivileged communities more than dominant culture communities. In North America, where I am at least, much more. The NRDC, what does it stand for? The Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office in the United States. They took data, I believe with another organization, don't quote me on that, but certainly the NRDC took data from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and they wanted to understand the impact of concentrated animal feeding operations. And in the data that they found in the Freedom of Information request, I have a quote in front of me. One of the quotes they found in the Freedom of Information request was, "The drinking water of millions of Americans living in or near farming communities across the country is contaminated by dangerous amounts of nitrates and coliform bacteria from fertilizer and manure." Dangerous amounts. And what they noted in their report, in the NRDC's report, was that these CAFOs are located near minority populations. So there's a trend towards minority populations living in and around CAFOs. Mm. And another study came out in 2022 that showed, it looked at socioeconomic disparities in relation to pollution. And they found that there is people with lower socioeconomic status tend to live in more polluted areas. Socioeconomic status, what I mean by that is access to healthcare, access to education, access to wealth. People with lower socioeconomic status tend to have more disabilities, for example, as well. And they found that to be correlated with pollution. There is a link between that. Manure, by the way, contains over 150 different pathogens, including Campylobacter, Salmonella, Listeria, E. coli, Cryptosporidium, which accounts for about 90%. I'm not saying 90% of all waterborne diseases from humans come from manure, but manure contains bacteria that account for 90% of all waterborne diseases. Which reminds me, of the Walkerton inquiry in Canada, where several people got very, very ill. I think it resulted in a couple deaths.
Wow.
In Ontario, and it was related to manure, cattle manure impacting the water. And nobody blamed the ranchers because they all followed the regulatory framework. They did not breach any laws. It was the water treatment people who were complacent. And the whole inquiry of the Walkerton instance was focused around water treatment, not what was making the water sick. It was how to cure the sick water to be good for human consumption, which just reflects our culture on how we're thinking about the environment.
Well, it's the allopathic way. If you think about it, like when we look at diseases, we don't look at the source, we just look at the disease and try to nuke it.
Exactly.
Like it's always the same.
Exactly. But not only for human health. So we discussed how CAFOs, especially in the United States, tend to be located in areas where there's minority populations, and millions of people around the United States are exposed to dangerous amounts of nitrates and other chemicals, and perhaps even bacteria, which is hard on human health. One of the things that came out of that study, by the way, was that there was no legal accountability under the Clean Water Act to protect communities against pollution. So they couldn't actually enforce much on these concentrated animal feeding operations. But the manure also impacts aquatic ecosystems. So when there's a leak or a spill, there could be massive impacts. And for example, in Ohio, in 2017, 3 spills killed 67,000 fish. Minnesota absorbs maybe 20 spills annually. And in one single Minnesota spill on Beaver Creek, around 700,000 fish died. Another one in 2012, a pig manure leak, resulted in the death of 150,000 fish and 18,000 mussels. And before the spill, biologists had been sampling the creek, looking at the different aquatic life forms. And after the spill, 2 years after the spill, those biologists tried sampling 9 of the different fish species they sampled prior to the spill. They found none.
Oh my.
2 years after a pig manure spill. So these impacts could be long lasting, and just devastating for aquatic life as well. Now, in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency estimated at the time of this report that about 17,000 CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, exist in the United States, but they could only identify about 7,500 of them. That's less than half. It's embarrassing how little data we have on these kinds of operations, and thus their impacts to human well-being and wildlife.
Yeah, I think we need to start using a little bit of common sense while the data supports the doubts, because otherwise a lot of people will actually get sick and lose life when we can prevent it. So I think we went into really heavy subjects, which I'm sure everybody will think, oh my gosh. Well, I think the silver lining is going on a plant-based diet can really make a big positive impact on all the problems we talked about. So if anything, even if you're not able to grow your food, even if you're not able to get into regenerative agriculture yourself, even if you're not ready to do big things, the biggest thing you can do is what is on your plate. And I'm really looking forward to going into details about the protein needs next week with Brenda and with you, Brenda, and Vesanto. But I saw, however, I like to end on a light note, and food is always such a great way to bring it together. I saw in the book some really amazing recipes. So, of course, cookies, and then the pad thai Asian noodles, that was so good. Now, Cory, you mentioned that you were doing cooking demos when you were a teenager, and I'm just wondering who wrote the recipes, who tested them, how did that go? Like, yeah, and also if you can share your favorite on both of your sides.
So I'm not going to take any credit for the recipes. I tried them, but it was really Mom and Vesanto, and they hired professional recipe testers professional recipe testers, and they went back and forth with these recipe testers until every single one got 5 stars. One of my go-tos, if I'm going to say a favorite, of course, the cookies are awesome. The chocolate cookies, definitely a favorite. Can't go wrong with a chocolate cookie, but I love the chickpea smash. It's just so quick and easy. And I don't always follow the recipe to the T, but it inspires me to try all new kinds of things. But chickpea smash, certainly a quick, easy go-to for my busy work life.
That's awesome. For you, Brenda?
And well, I love a lot of the recipes in here. Of course, developing them, it's pretty fun. But I just want to show one. This is, can you see this?
Yeah, that's a beautiful bowl.
Yeah, it's actually gado. So you make a spicy peanut sauce to put on all of these things. I love that. I think that's one of Vesanto's very favorites. And one of the ones that I get a lot of feedback on is this chili. It's called Easy Peasy Chili, and people just love it. It's very meat-like in its sort of texture, and it's wonderful. And I also love this one, which is the noodle one that you talked about.
Yeah.
So the nice thing about the book is we do have some lovely pictures to go with a lot of the recipes. But we definitely had some reasonable testing of the recipes done. So that was fun.
Amazing. When I was talking to your publisher, and we were discussing which 2 recipes I would like to put online, because I really wanted to share what people can expect from the book aside from the educational side. And I was like, okay, well, I chose the noodles and the cookies. I'm like, I'm salivating just looking at the pictures in the book.
Oh, great.
So I'm going to just say, me too. So yeah, and they are good. I actually tried them, and oh my God, very good. I love them. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chantal.
It was so nice to talk, and hopefully in the future, especially Cory, with more things that you can bring on to the table about the environment. I'd love to talk to you again. And Brenda, you're one of my favorites on the show, so I'll talk to you next week.
Vesanto and I are both really looking forward to it. So thanks so much for having us again.
My pleasure. See you soon.
Yeah, thanks so much for your awesome questions. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Brenda and Cory, for being on the show. I am so excited about all this information in plant-powered protein, because it really clarifies so much on all aspects. So guys, if you don't have this book, please do grab it. I put the link into the show notes. Also, stay tuned for next week as we continue with the subject, continue with this book, and we have Brenda and Vesanto Melina talking about the nutritional side and clarifying a lot of doubts and questions about protein. So guys, if you like this interview, if you like this episode, please make sure you share it, you like it, give us feedback, rate us, and help us grow. I'll see you next week. Bye.